Good day. I'm Amy Gutman, president of the University of Pennsylvania, speaking to you from our beautiful campus in Philadelphia. Thank you for joining us for the Penn Media Seminar on President Barack Obama's first 100 days in office. Not since Franklin Delano Roosevelt's first term as president has the nation so closely watched the first days of a new presidential administration. The challenges that the new administration is confronting are daunting, and the stakes incredibly high. President Obama's first 100 days are sure to be analyzed, discussed, and debated for years to come. During this media seminar, Penn experts will offer analysis and insight on the major issues of our time, from the stimulus package to the packaging of the president's message, from national health care to international relations. Our eminent Penn professors, drawn from the School of Arts and Sciences, the Wharton School, the School of Medicine, and the Annenberg School for Communication, will provide a multitude of lenses through which we can view the nascent Obama presidency. Welcome to the Penn Media Seminar, and welcome to the University of Pennsylvania.
Good afternoon. My name is John Jackson. I'm the Richard Perry University Associate Professor of Communication and Anthropology in the Annenberg School for Communication and the Department of Anthropology here at the University of Pennsylvania. I want to thank President Gutman for her wonderful introduction and to tell you that it is truly my pleasure to welcome the group of scholars we've assembled to talk about Barack Obama's first 100 days. Before we start, let me just take a second to explain to people the structure of this afternoon's event. We have 5 panelists: Diana Mutz, David Eisenhower, David Grande, Brooks Jackson, and Al Felsenberg. I'll try to introduce each one of them right before they speak. They'll all speak for about 10 to 15 minutes initially. And then after that point, we're going to open it up, both to the people who are here in attendance and those watching online, so they can answer questions about the hype and even hysteria around the first 100 days of Obama's initial political campaign in the White House. And maybe to start, let me just say a few words about our first speaker. That would be Professor Diana Mutz. Professor Mutz is the Samuel Stauffer Professor of Communication and Political Science here at the Annenberg School for Communication. She's also in the Department of Political Science here at the University of Pennsylvania. She teaches and does research on public opinion, political psychology, and mass political behavior, with a specific emphasis on political communication. Professor Mutz has published articles in a variety of academic journals, including the American Political Science Review, the American Journal of Political Science, Public Opinion Quarterly, the Journal of Politics, and the Journal of Communication. She is also the author, most recently, of the critically award-winning Hearing the Other: Deliberative versus Participatory Democracy. Today, Professor Mutz is going to start us off with a discussion about the tone of the electorate coming into, and to a certain extent, emerging out of what was a historic inauguration in January. Professor Mutz.
Thanks, John. I thought I'd get us started by making a few points about the public's reaction to President Obama thus far, and to try to explain to some extent why we may be hearing quite different interpretations of where Obama stands with respect to public reaction. The truth of the matter is that even looking at the very same kinds of public opinion data, one can come to pretty different conclusions about where he stands at the moment. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is. Let me start out by saying what most of you already know, and that is that overall Obama is clearly viewed quite positively by the public at the moment. Regardless of what poll you look at, his job approval rating is over 60% mark as of this April. And that's generally considered a very popular president. On the other hand, it's also true that Americans tend to like to rally around their presidents in times of crisis, and I think it's possible that Obama's popularity has benefited to some extent from the sense of crisis that we're feeling in the country at the moment. We all desperately want him to succeed with respect to the economy, but no one's who's completely honest with you, I think, can tell you that they know this plan will work with any degree of certainty. Only time will tell. And I think that's very much the mode that the American public is operating in at the moment. He is popular. On the other hand, it's important to note that this kind of popularity is not at all unusual early in administration. In fact, if you could pull up that first slide, if you look at recent presidents in the post-World War period, you'll see that this so-called honeymoon that goes on in the early part of our presidency is called that for a reason. That is, generally during the honeymoon period, there's very little that you've done thus far for people to be mad at you about. Once you start governing, typically your approval ratings come down. Interestingly, though, in Obama's case, there's been a whole lot happening in the first 100 days. I think most of us would agree. And as a result, there are quite a few things that people could be mad at him about already. So in that light, you might consider it pretty heartening that he's basically pretty average in his 100-day approval rating. That is, if you look at this slide, he's basically around the middle in terms of our post-World War presidents. He's not the most popular, he's not the least popular. He's right there about in the middle. In the next slide, I give you another perspective on Obama's popularity, and that is a question that asks the public how satisfied they are with the way the country is being governed. Now, given that Obama has inherited a very dire economic situation, it's not at all surprising that governing satisfaction is not at all high in the United States. Right now, around 29% of Americans indicate they're satisfied with how the United States is being governed. But what is interesting, and I think perhaps more telling, is the amount of improvement that we've seen since Obama took office. If you look at the slopes over time in the slide, you'll see that Obama's pretty much only second to Reagan in the amount of improvement in governing satisfaction that we've seen since he took office. So in the course of 100 days, things have improved. Obviously, they're still quite low, not surprisingly. One final point I want to elaborate on a bit more has to do with the partisan gap in judgments about how well Obama is doing, and particularly in looking at his job performance evaluations. Right now, the gap between Republicans and Democrats in their approval of Obama is at an all-time high relative to previous presidencies, as you can see in this slide. Of course, your own party's happier than the opposing party that just lost the election. Nonetheless, that gap is extremely high. It's at around 63 percentage points difference between the two parties right now. And that's nearly double the average, which is around 35% for post-war presidents. Overwhelmingly, Democrats are very approving of Obama's performance, not surprisingly, and that hasn't changed a whole lot. There's been a little movement, but basically there's been a high level of approval throughout the first 100 days. Given that polarization often gets worse during the course of an administration, the kind of extreme party divisions that we see already after only 100 days are worrisome for the long-term future of this administration, both in terms of the civility of public discourse that takes place, as well as for purposes of steps forward legislatively that require bipartisan effort. So there is some cause for concern. On the other hand, it's also true that the American public is different now than it was during these previous presidencies, and that may have something to do with the level of polarization in reactions to Obama's presidency. Just to show you in a little bit more detail, you'll see that the increased polarization is not really coming from the Democrats. During the course of the first 100 days, there's been a little bit of an increase in approval ratings from Democrats, but basically what you see is a flat line. Where the movement is coming from and the increased partisan polarization is coming from is, first of all, from Republicans. You see Republicans, the two lines there in the middle, of course they're more disapproving than Democrats, but if you look at the increase in the disapproval among Democrats, it has gone up quite significantly during the course of the first 100 days. Likewise, we've seen an increase in disapproval among independents as well. So both of those groups are contributing to some extent to his decline in approval. But again, overall, things look pretty good. So just to summarize my overall take on the public reaction during this first 100 days, I think there's a tendency, perhaps because it makes a better headline, to seize upon one particular statistics that seems to suggest that, you know, he's the most popular president we've ever had, or in the case of other partisan sources, that things are at a terrible all-time low. And to quote President Obama's press conference last night, things are never as good as they seem, nor quite as bad as they seem. And I think that's pretty much what we're seeing here at this point in time. John?
Thank you, Professor Mutz. I mean, at some point, of course, I think people are going to want to ask you two things probably. One is what Obama's been doing maybe to kind of feed some of this partisanship, if anything, but also how do we find a way out of this kind of polarizing partisan trap. So we'll see if maybe that comes up. You have an opportunity to maybe talk a little bit about that. I wanted to move now to our second speaker. Since the summer of 1997, as a public policy fellow at the Annenberg School for Communication, David Eisenhower has served as director of the Institute for Public Service, with responsibility for organizing a variety of symposia and for administering the Washington, D.C. Annenberg Summer Internship Program, which annually places a dozen Annenberg undergraduate majors in government-related internships throughout the Washington, D.C. area. He also administers comps for the Annenberg program, an academic concentration offered to communication majors here at Penn and one of our marquee programs for our undergraduates. And he lectures in courses such as special topics in mass communication, the presidency, and political conventions, debates, and campaigns. He's often able to take undergraduates to some of these conventions as well, which they greatly appreciate. Eisenhower is the recipient of 8 honorary degrees, the Golden Slipper Award for Community Service in Philadelphia, and was admitted to the Golden Key Society and given the Panet Award for Citizenship by the Annenberg School for Communication in 2002. Among other things, I think one of the things Professor Eisenhower will help us to try to think through is this discussion about the Obama aura. Right? Is there such thing as an Obama aura? If so, to what extent can it or will it last? Professor Eisenhower.
Thank you. This is the Obama aura is a topic that I think captivated journalists and observers throughout the 2008 campaign. The existence or the tarnishing of this aura is something that people have discussed in small groups and so forth since the inaugural, as the realities of governing has sort of encountered, I suppose, the dream or the aspirations of a campaign, and have brought forth as President Obama has become a governing figure, not simply a campaigning figure and so forth, this question arises. I had some thoughts in this connection, that is about the sustainability of the Obama administration and this aura and his future success as a president, in some thoughts that I've collected about these 100 days. And to begin with, the 100 days is a phrase that describes a standard of presidential performance set by Franklin Roosevelt in 1933. It has become, in the course of decades, the name of a season that happens every 4 years, which has taken on very ritualized aspects. Barring a catastrophe of the magnitude of 1932, this is an interval in which the President, Congress, campaign experts, pundits, citizens alike assess and come together tacitly to understand, I believe, the meaning of an election campaign. The election results are always murky business. Thinking back to then Senator Obama's victory statement on the night of November 4, 2008, I think that what that election verdict meant was unclear at that time. Certainly President-elect Obama had his notion of what it was. His backers had a notion, perhaps distinct, and Republicans had another notion. Was the 2008 election about race relations? Did it involve some question of validation? that his campaign symbolized? Was it about the Iraq War? Was it about health care? Was it about entitlements? Was it about taxes and fiscal policy? Was it about the economy? Was this a vote of no confidence in economic management? Or was it about some broader question about charting a new direction? As the 100 days conclude, I believe that President Obama, we can see now in hindsight that Barack Obama is president of the United States today because his change message in 2008 was best adapted to a mood in the electorate as a whole, which viewed our economy and our prospects as a society as being somewhat out of balance, that the delegation to the private sector as a matter of policy over a number of decades had become excessive, and that the private sector, as things stood in the year 2008, unaided, was not fit or able to allocate resources and aggregately to organize a sustainable economic future in this country. President Obama summarized this message in a very important speech just a couple of weeks ago at Georgetown University, which I think he's sort of summing up the 100 days, or handing people like us a way to analyze 2008 and to put it into words, where he is looking back on this recession of 2007, 2009, and making it clear that what his presidency brings to Washington is awareness that our economic difficulties are not a mere downturn. They are not an adjustment in an economic cycle, that we are undergoing what our brokers back in the early 1980s called a restructuring recession. The economy and society emerging from an Obama presidency are very likely to be different than the economy and society that entered that recession. Our future will be built on what he called a new foundation, pillars, health care and entitlement reform, green and sustainable industries, college education and infrastructure. It will be an economy that will feature greater government involvement and a shift in direction of American enterprise back to basics. That, I believe, is the thrust of his program, and I believe that that thrust connects the various threads of debate that we see going on in Washington now about cap and trade, universal health coverage, the stimulus, TARP 1 and 2, foreign policy. I believe they all relate to this overriding theme. As to his aura, President Obama, I believe, retains a considerable aura. I agree with Peter Hart, who is not here but is on our faculty, who says that we may be seeing a Reagan-type presidency at the beginning. This presidency so far reminds me a great deal of the Reagan presidency. One thing that Professor Mutz was discussing were the dips and the fluctuations in personal popularity of presidents. An interesting thing is present in the polls, and that is that President Obama is currently more popular than his policies. I first encountered that phenomenon and focused on it during the Reagan years. President Reagan was consistently more popular than his policies, and that was true not only in 1981 and 82, but all the way up through 1987 and 1988, as the electorate, imbibing in the aura of Reagan and Reaganism and the novelty of that presidency and its many outstanding features and so forth, gradually, step by step, reconciled itself to the new direction that Reagan was laying down in 1981 through 88. I think that something similar may be afoot right now. About 60-65% approval rating now. Again, these are standard measures, but I think that they do not capture, it seems to me, the depth of movement that appeared in 2008 in Obama's favor. These are numbers that are likely to sag if the parallel holds. As we move beyond the 100 days, which is the easier part, to the second 100 days, which is the hard part, and beyond, and the intractability of our economic problems become apparent. With a broad-based recovery, and this happened in the Reagan years in 1983, the aura combined with latent respect and affection for the president, combined with growing confidence in the course that he had charted and so forth, combined to produce extraordinary popularity, which may be in this president's future. There have been surprises, but I think that the most pleasant surprise of all has been a quiet but unmistakable change in tone in the news reporting over the past 90, 100 days. As recently as March 27th, 2009, and I remember that night, I was sitting in my office here at Annenberg. It was windswept, it was raining outside. I went on realclearpolitics.com and I read this article by Kenneth Cone entitled "America, Concentrate or Hang." This is about the economy. Anybody, he writes, who wants to pontificate about the economy or the budget or the deficit right now should think about three questions. What changed the Depression from an ordinary recession into a worldwide catastrophe? Is this crisis the same or different? Is there the risk of another depression, and how do we stop it? We should take this danger very, very seriously, he writes in March 27, 2009. Professing that he is a conservative, he's a Friedmanite from the University of Chicago, he concludes, have you noticed lately that people who sound confident about the economy are mostly talking head pundits who have no practical experience and no responsibility whatsoever? And that the people who know what they are talking about, like Bernanke, Volcker, Geithner, Summers, and Buffett, take a more cautious line. The situation is serious, but things will be fine if we do what we need to do. These folks face a delicate problem. They have to talk enough truth to justify spending trillions of dollars to stop this crisis without saying things which might scare consumers and businesses into total paralysis. I just don't think most Americans appreciate the danger. We must either concentrate or hang. This is a month ago. I don't think that anybody is speaking about our economy in those terms today. I think there has been a quiet awareness in that interval. Our thoughts have turned somewhat from disaster to plans for a recovery, and the idea that not if this recovery will happen, but when, and a growing sense that this crisis is passing, which will leave us at a point where the new direction that Obama's campaign and presidency is offering will come into sharper focus, and we will understand our possibilities, the possibilities that are before us. I think that this has been the signal accomplishment of 100 days, but also I think that what has become clarified in the last 100 days is the meaning of the 2008 election. There was a great aura surrounding it. There is a temptation to look back, or historians will undoubtedly look back and narrate this as the rise of an extraordinary young leader with an aura. That aura lasts, I believe, depending upon the future success of his presidency. We can speak today with greater confidence about what the 2008 election was about. As Howard Fineman did write, the hard 100 days lay ahead. So my conclusion is let the debates begin. Trust that it will be conducted in a fair, civilized, and ultimately a constructive manner. This presidency reminds me of a Reagan presidency of boarding, and the aura that has been somewhat dimmed as he takes office and becomes President Obama rather than sort of the mobilizer and leader, Senator Obama running for the presidency, somewhat dimmed, has, I think, the potential, looking down the road, to become a kind of Reagan-style presidency that would truly change for some time to come our notion of the federal government's role and its role in our lives and its role in managing all of the various components of this great society that we live in. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Our next speaker is David Grande. He's an assistant professor of medicine at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine and a senior fellow at the Leonard Davis Institute of Health Economics. Dr. Grande's research and work focuses on health policy with a specific emphasis on the healthcare safety net. He recently chaired the health transition team for Philadelphia's mayor, Michael Nutter, and has worked with the city of Philadelphia and the state of New Jersey on issues related to medical access. He also conducts research on aspects of medical professionalism, including the civic and social roles of physicians and the influences of commercial marketing on the profession itself. Dr. Grande trains in internal medicine at the hospital at the University of Pennsylvania, and he completed a master's in public affairs at Princeton University before becoming a Robert Wood Johnson Health and Society Scholar here at the University of Pennsylvania. David will help us make sense of the administration's early handling of the important, if somewhat controversial, issue of health care in the United States today. David.
Thank you. Well, it seems that it's almost a law of nature that the country has to address healthcare about every 15 to 20 years. We've been at this many times, and we've yet to see a president succeed in reforming the healthcare system. And so certainly it seems we are due again for a national conversation on healthcare reform. Certainly we saw it was a central issue in the Democratic primary that carried all the way through the ultimate battle between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. And much of the emphasis during that time was clearly on providing health insurance coverage to all Americans, as well as reining in healthcare costs. As the sequence of events unfolded throughout the fall, and the banking crisis ensued, and the economic crisis became more apparent, I think many of those who were very focused on healthcare reform grew increasingly concerned that healthcare reform would be pushed off of the agenda. What was interesting in the context of the campaign was during those closing 2 months, Barack Obama actually ran a lot of ads and invested heavily on both attacking Senator McCain's healthcare plans as well as running on his own. And so certainly he seemed to raise the stakes in the closing months of the campaign around fixing healthcare. Now, certainly many historians who've written about healthcare reform have emphasized the importance of really coming out of the gate strong and trying to address this issue when political capital is at its greatest. So with that, Tom Daschle, of course, was nominated as the first major cabinet nominee right after Election Day. And many events were kicked off right away, including a series of national house parties that were focused on trying to generate more national discussion around healthcare reform. So we know what happened to that nomination, and certainly that was an initial setback for the administration prior to inauguration. But soon after inauguration, what we certainly saw was some very early wins for now President Obama on healthcare reform. Within his first 2 weeks in office, he signed the Children's Health Insurance Program Reauthorization Act of 2009, which represented a significant expansion of health insurance coverage for low-income children in the United States. That issue had been a focus of a significant battle between the Democratic Congress and the Bush administration. And so this issue in many ways was ripe for action. Within the first 30 days, of course, much has been talked about with the stimulus bill and the Recovery Act. Within that Recovery Act, there was actually some very significant healthcare elements, some of which represent really profound changes in health policy and some investments in healthcare that represent significant changes. One that's been talked a lot about politically is the $1.1 billion invested in comparative effectiveness research, which I'll talk about in a moment. $19 billion invested into digitizing the healthcare system and bringing electronic medical records to doctors' offices and to hospitals. $1 billion towards prevention and public health, $10 billion towards biomedical research, and then large amounts of money to stabilize insurance coverage during this economic recession, both through COBRA and Medicaid. Now, the politics that has unfolded around comparative effectiveness research, I think, offer real insight into, I think, the kind of rhetoric that we are likely to hear around the healthcare reform debate over the coming months. And so, comparative effectiveness research is sort of a complicated name for a very simple concept, which is this is medical research which compares treatments for different medical conditions and puts them side by side against one another so that we can test the efficacy of different treatments. As you can imagine, we haven't done a lot of this research where we do really place treatments side by side one another. And so doing this and investing resources into this can really begin to threaten economic interests in healthcare. And so certainly we see the pharmaceutical industry, device manufacturers, and other producers of medical technology growing increasingly nervous about having their technology subjected to this type of research. Last week, during now Secretary Sebelius' confirmation hearing in the Senate, Senator Kyle released a press release afterwards, and within that said, the allocation of health resources is a euphemism for denying care based on cost. I believe in the right of every American to choose the doctor, hospital, and health plan of his or her choice. No Washington bureaucrat should interfere with that right or substitute the government's judgment for that of a physician. That statement was in specific response to Secretary Sebelius' expressing strong support for conducting comparative effectiveness research. And so what for many health policy experts sounds like a relatively straightforward thing that we ought to be doing, in the political context, we certainly see already how the rhetoric that will become part of the healthcare reform discussion could really take center stage. If we look at the politics around healthcare reform and what the congressional landscape looks like, we certainly see, in contrast to the 1990s, very unified leadership in both the House and the Senate of the committee chairmen who've been very active on healthcare historically. And this is very different in the early 90s during the Clinton years, when you had long-standing committee chairmen who, quite frankly, had their own ideas about how to reform healthcare and weren't really interested in pushing President Clinton's vision. We also see large majorities in the House, which will enable House Democrats to really push through a Democratic vision for healthcare reform. Of course, the big question that remains is what will happen in the Senate. The question is the Senate filibuster-proof? Here in Pennsylvania, there's obviously been some significant developments this week with Senator Specter changing parties. There's a lot of people looking at Minnesota to see what will ultimately happen there with Al Franken and Norm Coleman. But with that, the Democrats did pass the budget resolutions in both the House and the Senate yesterday. And within that, they did include budget reconciliation instructions for healthcare reform. So should they not be able to achieve 60 votes, they have left themselves open to a 51-vote path towards reforming healthcare. Interest groups so far. Certainly interest groups play a huge role in the discussion of healthcare reform. Many of the traditional stakeholders have been relatively muted so far and have been participating in a lot of the inside dialogue that is going on, particularly on the Senate side. But this, as soon as legislation is written and there are details in there, this is certainly likely to change. But one significant difference on the interest group side does seem to be from the early 90s until now, that liberal advocacy groups seem far more organized for this healthcare reform debate. The Healthcare for America Now Coalition is a multi-million-dollar entity now, which has brought together and coordinated the voices of many liberal advocacy groups who are pushing for healthcare reform. And already they've demonstrated their ability to be responsive to many of the challenges being posed for healthcare reform. So the healthcare fight that lies ahead. So obviously you've heard a lot about, we have a very popular president who still has a lot of political capital. He has signaled that healthcare reform will be likely, if not one of the top, potentially the most important signature domestic policy issue, aside from fixing the economy, that he will tackle this year. And he has stated that repeatedly, both in his address before the joint session of Congress, as well as recently in his speech at Georgetown. So where will the fault lines be in this discussion? You already see that there's a significant fight going on around what the vision for healthcare reform is. So from the Democrats, we've seen a general vision for continuing to rely on the private insurance market in general, but creating much more regulations around that marketplace where people would go to purchase their insurance. Many Democrats have proposed providing the choice of a public health insurance option, which would be sponsored by the government, and this has already brought out attacks about government health care. And so this is turning out to be a major fault line in the debate. The scope of mandates, who will be required to either purchase or provide coverage, either employers, individuals, or some combination, and the scope of those mandates will be a big point of debate. And then finally, of course, paying for reform. President Obama proposed some provisions as to how to do that. with certain tax provisions on high-income wage earners, and certainly got a lot of pushback on his proposals. The opposition, just like every healthcare reform debate in the past, will undoubtedly try to stoke fears of change. We have to remember that an overwhelming majority of Americans have insurance today. While they may be anxious about losing their insurance, they do in general have insurance. And so any kind of discussion or debate that makes them fearful about losing what they have presents the biggest challenge for advocates of healthcare reform and the president. I do believe that healthcare, given that it will become the central focus of domestic policy reform for President Obama, will become a proxy fight for a broader partisan battle that I think will help define in these early years, and this year in particular, whether President Obama is a successful president or not. So I think that we can expect, as we've already seen, Republicans are likely to dig their heels in on this issue, and it could be a very polarized debate. But I do think, in closing, that optimism for healthcare reform is as high now as I think it's ever been. Part of that is attributable, I think, to the unique economic times that we're in, and a lot of anger that is certainly building up in the country, certainly around banks, but I think that has extended onto the insurance industry as well. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Maybe we'll also talk a little bit about how this anger gets channeled in some of these formal political processes. Our next speaker, our next panelist is Brooks Jackson, an award-winning journalist who's covered Washington and national politics for over 30 years, reporting in turn for the Associated Press, the Wall Street Journal, and CNN. At CNN, Jackson pioneered the AdWatch and FactCheck format of stories, debunking false and misleading political statements, starting with the presidential election in 1992. His investigative reporting has won several national awards and is the author of several books, including Honest Graft, Big Money in the American Political Process, Broken Promise, Why the Federal Election Commission Failed, and most recently, Unspun, Finding Facts in a World of Disinformation, co-written with our Annenberg colleague, Kathleen Hall Jameson. Jackson today will try to help us think through the extent to which Obama's statements, the administration's message, has been accurate and on target thus far in this initial term.
Thank you. Well, we actually yesterday posted an article on our website, factcheck.org, addressing this very subject, how's Obama doing in the truth-telling department. And here's what we said at the top. After 100 days in office, we find President Obama is sticking to the facts, mostly. Now, we could leave it at that, but where would the fun be in that? Our business, of course, is to look for misinformation, and we look pretty hard. We try to monitor all the speeches and news conferences, things said by the president, and also things said about the president. What we come up with are some misstatements by the president from time to time, and we've also noted something of a pattern in these. It's not going to be surprising when you hear it. Well, let me start with a disclaimer. First of all, we cannot measure the degree to which any president or any person is straying from the truth, or how important a misrepresentation might be, or even whether it's deliberate, because we're not mind readers. We don't have any scientific mendacity index to apply, and we try to stay away on our website from keeping score or classifying who's telling the biggest whoppers, or who's telling the most, or which party or which candidate is the most serious misrepresenter of facts, simply because there's just no objective scientific way to measure that. So anything I might give you in that regard, any characterizations, are going to be personal judgments based on a career as a journalist in Washington, not a scholarly scientific measurement. With that disclaimer, I will say that what we've found in Obama, primarily, I think you could classify as puffery that falls within what seemed to me, as a journalist anyway, to be normal bounds of salesmanship for any president. Let me give you some examples, and you can maybe decide for yourself. We found For example, in selling his, the pattern we found, I should say, first of all, is that when Obama strays from the facts, he does so in a way that either makes his own policies look better than the facts might warrant, or makes the problems that his policies are addressing look more serious or pressing than the facts might warrant. So examples of those, he said at a news conference that, excuse me, I lost my place here, that the, darn it. Well, he said that, I don't have the exact quote for you, but when challenged on his budget and the vast deficits that are going to be drawn up, he said, this is the primetime news conference before the one last night, he said, well, our budget is, the economic assumptions in our budget are in line with those of the blue chip private economists. He was speaking of the blue chip economic forecast, which is kind of a poll, a consensus of 50 or so leading economists. And in fact, he was wrong. He would have been right to have said when we drew up our budget 2 months ago, it was pretty much in line with what private economists were saying. But at the time he spoke, private economists had grown much more pessimistic, and the ramifications of that, of course, are that if private economists were right, the deficits were going to be even larger than Obama was projecting. So by saying that private economists agreed with his budget projections, when in fact they didn't at that point, he was making his own budget projections, deficit projections, look less dire than they might otherwise be. We found him, again, on a matter of spending, and just to show you how what he is doing is not typical of presidents, we found him using a device that was identical with something we criticized his predecessor for, President Bush. He said, and here I do have the quote, we are reducing, he wanted to focus now on, remember his budget is calling for vast increases in federal outlays, and then he said, we're worried about deficits. We are reducing non-defense discretionary spending to its lowest level since the 60s. Well, we looked, and in fact, by the end of his first term, according to his own budget, that category, non-defense discretionary spending, was projected by his own budget people to be higher than in many years in several previous presidencies, so that wasn't true. But what I found the more revealing misrepresentation or misleading tactic here is to focus on this one narrow category of spending, non-defense discretionary spending. George Bush had done the very same thing when his spending was going up and he was being called to task for that. He said, well, look at the non-defense discretionary category. It turns out that that's less than 20% of total federal spending, and it's the old magician's trick. It's look over here, don't look at this, what's going on with the lady that you thought I was sawing in half over here. It diverts our attention. It's good salesmanship, but it is deceptive to some degree. And the area of looking at sort of blowing up problems to make them look more dire than they really are. He said at a joint session of Congress on February 24th, we import more oil today than ever before. Well, surprisingly, that's not true. Oil imports actually peaked in 2005. They're lower now. It's certainly true that the long-term trend has been up, but what he said, which most people probably wouldn't even question, was not actually true. He said it on another occasion that his the school drop, this is on an address on education on March 10th, the school dropout rate has tripled in the last 30 years. So naturally you should pass our education reforms. The Department of Education says the dropout rate has actually declined by a third. So I don't know where he's getting that statistic, but it's not true. A wonderful bit of salesmanship, which he repeated again last night. He's fond of saying that his stimulus bill is going to create or save 3.5 million jobs. Well, which is it? In fact, we haven't created any jobs. And said last night, we've already created or saved 150,000 jobs. Well, saved, maybe. But the fact is, the economy's been losing about 22,000 jobs per day since he took office, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Saving jobs, well, compared to what? Who says? Which jobs? We don't know, and we're looking for backup on his claim that he has somehow saved 150,000 jobs already. This, of course, something that's going to be impossible to prove or disprove, but it's an interesting tactic anyway. Again, I would characterize in general the misstatements that we found from President Obama to be presidential puffery, not terribly serious in my experience in covering presidents for a long time. We have found on if you turn now and look at the things said about President Obama, there have been some pretty serious misstatements of fact by the opposition, and it's creating an environment that may help to explain some of this wide partisanship gap that you saw earlier, and the fact that Republican approval for Obama is taking a nosedive. There has been a concerted decision by Republicans in Washington to not only not support the Obama agenda when it comes to things like stimulus spending, but to attack it. Now, the kinds of tactics, though, being used, you can recall, I'm sure, if you watch any cable news, all sorts of examples of horrible things that were supposedly in the stimulus bill, and wasteful, silly spending, golf carts, and who knows what else. My favorite was the claim that Obama's stimulus bill provided $8 billion to spend on a levitating train to run from Disneyland to Las Vegas. Well, it's true that there has been on the boards a proposal to build a 300-mile-an-hour magnetic levitation train similar to one that's currently operating on an experimental basis, a 7-mile track in Japan. But the truth is that there wasn't a penny specifically earmarked for that train in the stimulus bill. It was just a claim made up out of whole cloth. The $8 billion was set aside for high-speed rail. As it's turned out, the Department of Transportation has announced that they will focus that money on 10 existing rail routes. The Anaheim to Las Vegas route is not among them. And it may be that there will be some of that $8 billion will somehow find its way to the maglev train project, but it hasn't so far, and that was just a totally unsupported claim on the part of Obama's opposition. One last one that I'll close with, because we're posting a new article along these lines today, an emerging line of attack against what the president proposes to do in health care. Which, by the way, there's no legislation so far, but his opponents have seized on something in the stimulus bill, calling it, Congressman Tom Price of Georgia claimed that in that bill was, quote, a national health care rationing board, unquote. Well, there's no national health care rationing board or anything remotely approaching that in the stimulus bill or anywhere else. What Price and some others were referring to is a panel that would conduct studies of which treatments are most cost effective and disseminate that information to physicians. The idea, of course, is that if a doctor figures that he could or she can cure you for a buck rather than $10, probably you ought to try the dollar treatment first. But there's no compulsion involved, and in fact language in the law that would prevent that. So this is and there's a new ad out which our article that we're posting today will be taking on by a brand new interest group that's sprung up since Obama took office, I believe. And they're putting $1 million behind an ad making a very similar claim, which, again, to stress, is not true. So what's for the future? I expect that as the healthcare debate engages, as we get into the debate over cap and trade, which is going to, if it goes through, will force changes in the economy on a massive scale. Anybody who burns carbon fuel is going to be affected. we will see plenty of million-dollar and multi-million-dollar advertising campaigns, plenty of factual claims, and not all of them will be true. And we will be very busy at FactCheck.org. That's my prediction. Thank you.
Thank you, Brooks. Our final panelist today is Al Felsenberg, who was the principal spokesman for the 9/11 Commission and has served in 2 presidential administrations. He has been an advisor to the U.S. Departments of Defense and State and held several senior posts at the U.S. House of Representatives. In the 1980s, he was New Jersey's Assistant Secretary of State. Dr. Felsenberg has appeared as a commentator on major public affairs television shows, including CNN's Crossfire, C-SPAN's Washington Journal, and many, many others. He has contributed to the Washington Post, the Weekly Standard, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Boston Globe, the Christian Science Monitor, and the National Review Online. His most recent book is The Leaders We Deserve and a Few We Didn't, Rethinking the Presidential Rating Game, which came out last year. Al Felsenberg has developed a new method for measuring presidential leadership, and he'll try to help us figure out what criteria we might use and how we might operationalize that criteria to help make sense of the way we would begin to rate the new presidency of Barack Obama.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take a bit of a change of pace. I'll put my categories out, and I want to talk about 2 because I think most will be incomplete. One, I advise readers to look at the president's character. His sense of vision, his sense of confidence. Well, we'll talk about character and vision, we'll have confidence, we'll see how things work. But then at the end of the story, how he did in 3 areas, and as whether he promoted advanced freedoms around the world and at home. We can find that when the questions come. And of course, economic policy, and national defense and foreign policy. Let me start with the president himself. The United States is one of the few democracies that combine the role of the head of state and the head of the government. And I think Obama, like Reagan before him, gets this very, very well. Reagan, for 8 years, was General Electric's host. He was host of the country. He carried himself beautifully. Even people that did not vote for him and did not like him could not say that he handled that D-Day event magnificently. And of course, he spoke for us all during the terrible tragedy of the Crusaders. These are the moments of Reagan we remember. There's no doubt Obama gets it. He gets the important part of that role. He looks good up there. We are proud to send him abroad. We are proud to hear him last night. This is the man in control of the situation. He understands his own historical importance as a role model and as a ceiling breaker, if you want. I'll go as far as to predict that there will be controversies. There may even be scandals in this administration, as any scandal any administration has had. But they won't be about the president's person. They'll be about his ideals. They'll be about subordinates. They'll be about issues. But he gets his role, and he's not going to step on that. And people I know who covered him in the campaign and who actually work with him now have told me that some of these Reagan parallels are not accidental. He studied Reagan, he studied Kennedy, he studied Roosevelt, great communicators. Which gets me to his role as a sense of vision. Now, most great presidents not only have a reason to be president. Obama talks about transformational presidents. He cited Reagan in the campaign that said Ronald Reagan was a transformational president in a way Bill Clinton was not. So he gets his place in time. Most great presidents have also used means of communication available to them, the most advanced possible, to further their goals to communicate with people. The telegraph was elected before Lincoln was president. He was the first one to take the president to the battlefield through the telegraph, commandeering orders from generals. The radio was around before FDR. They broadcast Harding's inaugural, full of his speeches. Roosevelt was the first one to figure out how to use the voice to make the listener imagine he was actually in the room with you. Harry Truman was the first TV president. Most people who see him now on AmericanRhetoric.com would agree he wasn't very effective in that role. John Kennedy became the first television. And of course, with Obama, we've heard the story about new technology. and the internet. And you know, if you read the story in Fast Company magazine about the young man from Facebook who made Obama president, he's left among many reasons because the government can't compete fast enough. They can't, you know, if they want to accommodate his role, his new technology, it will take 9 months of bids and contracts. He just said, I'll help you from the outside, see you in 3 years. We'll see if we can break through this miasma of government red tape and bureaucracy to make the government function as well as the campaign. But they're there. Let me say a word or two about Michelle Obama. She gets it too. And I don't think any amount of media advice and White House spinners can create a personality that's not there. She's a very warm person. This has come across. She's very comfortable in her own skin, as is the president. I think she was done a bit of an injustice by the media and the campaign. This is a woman quite proud of her country, quite proud of her role in it, and quite willing to lift the curtain a bit for the young people in America to see what the president does and how it's done. I think the comparisons with Jackie Kennedy, you know, I love Jackie too, but Jackie would not have mixed it up with ordinary people in Europe the way she did. She's taking this beyond. The clothes, yes, I'll give you that for the fashion statement, but she's gone further than Jackie in talking with ordinary people and ordinary kids, and I think it's wearing well. And I think the her warmth and his sense of cool and calm, collective worked very well. I didn't say cool, I said cool. Now, part of that head of state is to reassure, to be calm and steady during very difficult times. You don't want to see the president on television panicking. Did it very well last night. He said it's a serious situation. We're monitoring this. No cause for panic. We're taking precautions. And I think he'd been criticized so much for saying how much of the bad things he inherited from Bush. He gets a tip of the hat from some Republicans by saying the Bush administration actually did some of this well, which came across. Republicans were listening again. The British would put the Queen out to make announcements like this because Blair or any other Prime Minister, Brown, would be seen as a partisan character. Well, we combine both. He's done it very, very well. Now, we give it with one hand and we take away with the other. Let me say a little bit about his use of the office. Now, I think those of us, many of us, who wrote about imperial and imperious presidencies in past generations, and how the balance needs to be restored and Bush overreached and blah, 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 blah. I think a lot of these critics are going to find themselves taking some of these words back. Our colleague Kathy College-Jameson was asked to comment on George Bush's major legacy. She said the use of the signing statement, that signing statements go back at least to Theodore Roosevelt, but she said he's made this an art, that I won't veto this, but I'm not enforcing under these circumstances. One of Obama's first comments was that he would not, his famous line that he uses over and over, that he wouldn't roll out the use of signing statements as an alternative to vetoes and signatures. Now, in terms of running the White House, now, this is something I would love to see fleshed in as we go, maybe as the questions come. The use of the White House staff, let me say, we have more czars in this administration than we have seen in all of Imperial Russia. We were supposed to have Daschle as the czar over health care. We do have Carol Browder as the czar over energy environment, and this means that she's supposed to run, oversee areas that impinge on this, interior, agriculture, EPA, those agencies that deal with the air and the seas and everything else. Then we have General Jones. Now, nothing against General Jones. We're pretty confident as I can tell. I wouldn't recognize General Jones if he sat next to me on Metro. I would recognize Hillary Clinton. I'd even offer her my seat. Now, why do I say this? I say this because Ms. Bronner, whoever becomes the health care spokesman, and General Jones are appointed by the president, not confirmed by the Senate. And one of our greatest controversies, as you'll remember, with the 9/11 Commission, was trying to get Condi Rice to testify in front of the 9/11 Commission with the cameras going in an open public hearing. White House said executive privilege. What she says to the president is privileged. You can talk to Powell because you confirmed him. You can talk to Rumsfeld because you confirmed him. The Senate can't talk to my people. Well, It's a lot of power to give Mr. Jones to run roughshod if we're supposed to believe the newspapers and pull Ms. Clinton and Gates and all these chariots in one direction and not hear from him, not have to hear testimony and have executive privilege. We haven't seen Bronner since she was introduced to us. Next point, all administrations, and it's too early to condemn this one, but why not? All administrations eventually fall into the hubris trap. And I can always tell which of my students have really read The Best and the Brightest, and which have basically absorbed the title and want to be the best and the brightest. Halberstam did not mean it as a compliment. He didn't try to assert that Bundy and McNamara and all these people were not bright. And they certainly were, in their own generation, considered best, but they were insular. They would talk to 95 people like themselves and say they have now surveyed people and everything they're doing in Vietnam is fine and all these systems work. Well, we have Mr. Geithner, we have Mr. Orzak, we have Mr. Volker, we have Mr. Summers, we have Mr. Goolsbee, we have Ms. Roman. I don't know who the president's economic spokesperson is. I know one thing, if you take Paul Volcker out of this picture, they look extremely similar in background, temperament, education, and advocacy. And if you see the New York Times, hardly a newspaper critical of the president, the New York Times did a 3-page story on Geithner Monday. And the whole story here was not exactly tone deafness, but hangs around the same people. I mean, he golfs with the people at AIG, and he was mentored by the people at Citibank, and he has the capacity at the Fed to actually give cease and desist orders when staff has to. And, well, it reminds me a lot of The Best and the Brightest, so I'm hopeful. It reminds me of what Sam Rayburn told LBJ when he said, you know, we got this new administration, we got 435 Rhodes Scholars, we're so happy. And Johnson said he'd be happy if, you know, one of them ran for sheriff. Rayburn said, well, we've got those who ran for sheriff. Ironically, the president. The president ran for Congress. The president was a state senator for 8 years. So he gets it. He's been there. He's been in the Rayburn role. His chief of staff gets it. He was a congressman and he worked for another administration. But I don't know about the advisors. And so we're going to find out what Obama and Emmanuel and others bring to this table as decisions are made. Now, how does Obama make decisions? Don't know. We know what the White House leaked. The White House leaked that he decided to release these, well, they're calling them now the torture memos, but he decided to release them after having an advocate for the CIA, Leon Panetta, argue the case in front of him against release, and then an aide to the Attorney General argued the case for release, and he sat there like the law professor he was, or the law review editor that he was, and decided. Well, we don't want Lyndon Johnson, we don't want groupthink, we don't want here's what I think and you get mine, we don't want that. But at the end of the day, we don't want to split the difference, which is what we got. And I can give you some other examples of this. Now, the last president who leaked that he made decisions by having people debate in front of him was not a president who was transformational and not a fellow we know much, but he was also the last law professor. Well, Clinton was a law professor, so take that out. He was the last professional law professor, William Howard Taft. Not a president we think much of. But when Taft would decide whether to sign or veto a bill, he'd bring the sponsor in and he'd bring the opponent in. And of course, Taft's greatest achievement was on the Supreme Court. Well, I hope we do other things, but I don't know whether the story is true. I know they leaked. Now there's the paradox, I think, with our president. He's perfectly willing and able to apologize for errors that the United States may have committed. We can discuss those later. But every time he may make a slip of the tongue, or a bit of an error, or a bit of a growing pain, or an attempt to grow colex, and it doesn't quite work, that slip becomes a doctrine. We'll call it the lobbyist problem. Well, you're fighting with John McCain, you don't want lobbyists for administration. How do you out-lobby McCain? How do you say, well, I'm more reformed than you? So you issue an edict that no lobbyists will ever work for me. Well, Number one, I'd like to take us all to 30th Street Station. We will stop commuters on their way home. We'll ask them what a lobbyist is. We can ask them if they've ever read a lobbyist, okay? And he issues as only a lawyer would. He issues an edict that says no lobbyists. Well, two problems with that. One problem is, except when I say that they're indispensable, so when I want to hire a defense contractor for the Pentagon, we'll have a dispensation. But at the same time, we say, a lobbyist for the Cancer Fund, for the AIDS Hospital, for the ASPCA, the Animal Shelter, for the University of Pennsylvania, can't work for me, no matter how skillful, because I back myself into this edict. Now, if John F. Kennedy could say, after a very close election in 1960, because there really wasn't a missile gap, or he actually let McNamara and say I was lying, you know. Obama wasn't lying, but he can say, you know, I looked at this lobbyist business, and there are good lobbyists, there are bad ones. And we're to judge the character of the person and the references he comes with rather than his occupation as a way of admitting or barring people. All right, now, at some point, I was talking, first of all, talking to David about this earlier. At some point, very significant presidents, whether it comes early, whether it comes late, they have to break their base at some point if they're going to go down in history as a transformational president. And they're going to do some of the things that we need done, whether it be on health care or foreign policy, right down the line. Lyndon Johnson, we know as the man who passed civil rights and voting rights legislation. We know less well that it didn't pass to Lyndon Johnson because Lyndon Johnson himself torpedoed efforts by Harry Truman to pass it when he was a Southern senator representing his region, and weakened a bill that passed in the Eisenhower administration. Yet Lyndon Johnson, as President of the United States, says, I am now President of all the people. I am not a Southern senator. And it's going to happen. And he said that he himself knew that he was sentencing his party to defeat in his own region for a generation. He did it. I remember the day Richard Nixon went on television in the summer of 1971 to announce that he would visit the People's Republic of China. I don't think Bill Buckley ever got over this till the day he died. And if you read National Review, they were willing to impeach Nixon before the Watergate was even constructed, let alone burgled. So he was willing to break with the right. He was willing to say, at the middle of the height of the China Revolution, that we cannot ignore a billion people, and I'm going. He didn't care what the right wing said. Now, it was George Will, not the American left, who wrote that Reagan was gaga when he was believing Gorbachev and his perestroika and all this stuff, that the old man's gone soft. Well, when Will comes to campus, we're going to ask him if he's taken that back. And of course, it was Bill Clinton that reached out to the Republicans to pass NAFTA. Now, I know Paul Krugman thinks, and Joe Stiglitz, those are the two, and we haven't heard from Michael Moore yet. I know they think Obama hasn't been enough with the old-fashioned democratic religion, but there is going to be a point somewhere down the line where Obama is, if you're going to be a unifying president, if you're going to bring us together, at some point you have to say to some of the people who brought you to the party so much and no more. Now, before I end, I took a look and we talked about 100 days, what it means. Now, before we end with this, I was quite surprised that Obama, like my colleagues have pointed out, has trusted part of his agenda to Congress. He said last night that he doesn't control, he doesn't really. I remember presidents calling Congress back at the special session. We talked about changing the culture of Washington. I lived in Washington for 19 years now. I have never seen Congress work a 5-day week. Okay, if there's a sense of urgency, they don't leave. They did not leave during World War II. We made sure by rationing gas and mileage and everything else. But if this is an emergency, you stay here and get this thing done. Second, most of these committee chairs supported somebody else for president. He's giving them his legacy. Now, just last week, we had the chairman of the House Agriculture Committee say that Obama's plan to take away the agriculture subsidy, okay, would pass over his dead body. Well, Lyndon Johnson would have said very boldly, that could be arranged. Well, Obama said no. But okay. And then we get to the House, Charlie Rangel. The president here, I think, is a bad idea. He wants to limit the amount of charitable deduction for rich people. Well, Rangel said no. Well, I think it's a bad idea because it would hurt places like Penn and the Philadelphia Symphony and the Philadelphia Museum, but leave that, Franklin Institute, leave that aside. Obama was counting on those two moves to pay for between $400 and $600 billion of his health care plan. And yet, people who supported other people when he was running for president torpedoed this. All through Franklin Roosevelt's tenure, all through his tenure as Speaker, Sam Rayburn defined his job as passing the president's program. What does the Speaker do? I get the votes out for the president's program. And as David will know, he said the same thing when he had a Republican president. Ike wants an interstate highway program. How do I get it passed? My job as Speaker is to pass the president's program. Nancy Pelosi has not said that. She said, we've got lots of ideas. We've got a Democratic Congress. Before we had a Democratic president, we have to talk about this, we have to talk about that. Well, as I say, at some point, you have to draw a line somewhere. Finally, the reason I say incomplete, I didn't make the comparison to FDR. Others did. A week after his election, we had a picture of Obama on the cover of Time, dressed as Franklin Roosevelt, cigarette holder, peach day, all this. All right. By April of first of all, we have to decide if we're in a crisis or not. And one way to tell us we're in a crisis is to have Congress meet through the weekends. Don't take 2 weeks off for Washington's birthday. Don't take 2 weeks off for Easter. Don't take, a week and a half for Flag Day and Constitution Day and everything else. You know, when World War II was being fought, people didn't expect the congressman to be home every weekend dedicating traffic lights. I mean, let's do what you're paid to do. But here, by 15 major bills that passed by the April mark in Franklin Roosevelt's time. 5 days after his inauguration, we had the bank holiday. A month later, we had Glass-Steagall with Federal Deposit Insurance. About a month after that, we had the Security Exchange Commission, which is supposed to go after the people with the watered-down stocks. As Roosevelt allegedly said when he named Joe Kennedy for the job, takes a thief to catch a thief. Remember that? We had the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, that sent it to the Dust Bowl. All these young people, this is the AmeriCorps of the 1930s. All these young people were sent out to reforest. What was at that time a terrible situation. TVA, which brought Lyndon Johnson into politics. Damn the Tennessee Valley, free or cheaper power for the poorest people in the country. Agriculture changes. All these things the Supreme Court later threw out, we can come back and talk about. It was not until 1935 until the crowning achievement of the New Deal Social Security Act was passed. So my question really, as we watch this, because I don't know the answer, I'm going to end by saying I'm not saying too much. I'm not saying too much too fast. I'm saying a little sense of priorities and a little sense of, Ruth Marcus asked this in the Washington Post, which Democrats are afraid of the administration? Who shall be the first to be rolled? It will send a message to the others as we start getting to health care and other things. And I yield back to my chairman.
Thank you, Alan. Thanks to all the panelists for their insights. We have about 15 minutes left, so I just want us to sort of cut to the chase and get going. And I'm going to start with the preoccupation I have, which I mentioned earlier about this partisanship in contemporary American politics. And it seems to be kind of spectered throughout all of the discussions here today. So in terms of Obama's supposed aura, clearly, aura or not, he's not inoculated from this partisan criticism. The health care bill becomes one of these partisan sticking points par excellence in some ways. The sort of presidential puffery that Brooks Jackson talks about is read quite less generously across ideological and partisan lines, right, than you would be willing to offer up. And of course, Obama may or may not be the president we deserve, but for a lot of people, he may even be an un-American president, right, if they're reading from across that kind of partisan fence. And so my question is going to be the first question we've gotten from viewers online, is a question I'm going to direct to you, Diana, since you sort of open up the discussion on partisanship. And I think I'll ask us all to be relatively brief. I'll try to maybe give each question, at least one person as respondent to take responsibility for it. If other people want to chime in, feel free. We'll just try to move as quickly as we can. The first question. Republicans are turning their backs wholesale on the president, this viewer says. Wasn't all the talk about partisanship just that, political talk? And can Obama really make Republicans and Democrats get along?
Ultimately, no. I mean, there is a two-party system for a reason. There are differences that are real between Republicans and Democrats, but it's true that polarization is worse now, and there are lots of things that have documented that. Interestingly, though, it's far worse among elected officials than it is among the mass public. And that leads many political scientists to believe that its origins may in many ways be structural, meaning that as safe congressional districts make it easier for more extreme candidates of either party to get elected, we end up with a leadership in Congress that is more polarized. Lots of evidence that Congress is more polarized historically. But again, there have been points in our history when they've been equally polarized where they are now. So it's not the end of the world. It's there. It's structural in many ways. I think the key thing in the course of the Obama administration is that everything we know about economic credit and blame is that if things improve, the president will get credit for that. And although, yes, some Republicans might claim it would have happened anyway or come up with other ways not to credit the president, the truth of the matter is his popularity among Republicans will improve if the economy improves as well.
Thanks, Dan.
I'd second everything you said, particularly on if we could have a fairer way of doing legislative redistricting that would give a chance to have a barometer where every district will be competitive. We have a 90% return rate, which is probably higher than the Soviet Presidium at its height. The Senate is more competitive. The framers expected the opposite to happen. They thought the state legislatures would appoint senators, and every 2 years, the voters would decide to throw out Congress if they didn't like what they were doing. So these people are basically drawn to be Republicans and Democrats. Now, when you get to the Senate, very briefly, there are two ways to get bipartisanship. One way is to as they say, cherry pick 3 or 4 votes, which they did do to pass the stimulus. The other is to go to the other party, the other leader, and say, what do I have to give up to get you? And I said Everett Dirksen brought 29 of 34 Republicans to pass on the Johnson Civil Rights and break the filibuster. And, well, Everett, what do you need? Well, take out the poll tax. We'll do that later through constitutional amendment. They did that. Put off voting rights a year. They did that. The most important thing now is public accommodation. Well, I would roll my side and tell them that I got you to take it out. Well, if they're going to be bipartisan, Mitch McConnell has to be able to go back to his team and say, what is there about the Republican program Obama's willing to live with? Or, partisanship may not always be a bad thing. If Obama has 60 votes and he feels that's the way to go, damn the torpedoes, go. So there are two ways to do it, and I'm not quite sure which way we're going to wind up. Probably the latter. If we get the thing at 60, probably the latter.
Thanks, Al. I'll maybe send this next question to David Eisenhower.
It's
from.
I was going to say, I think this is an unspoken. Or you had a different question. I was going to say the partisan divide is. I think I want to underscore the point that Diana made. This is unheard of. We're talking 168 votes in the House. We're not talking partisan differences that can be measured by, say, 80-20 on one side or 80-20 on the other. We're looking at unanimous votes, which just my reaction to this is a sort of idiosyncratic one, I guess. And that is, I wonder whether Republicans understand the options or the courses that are really open to an opposition party under the circumstances. I don't think, and the Gingrich people in the Republican Party seem to think that this is the case. I don't think the country is interested in their ideas at the moment. These ideas have been tested for 25 or 30 years. They underwent a trial in the 2008 election. I think if 100 days have produced any clarification, it's that the issue, the great issue in 2008, really was the structure of our economy. We've had a referendum on that. What the opposition has an opportunity to do is maybe not to advance ideas, which they will advance someday, but to improve what communication scholar would call ethos, and that is character. Their character. They have an opportunity to demonstrate a certain quality of opposition that would persuade the American people in time that they are right, that they are standing in line, they are next, and so forth, and that they are eligible to govern. These 168 zip votes baffle me, and what it amounts to is a sort of outlook in which stimulus programs are about cost-benefit analysis. They're about pork barrel projects that can benefit your district. A unanimous vote implies that this is an altogether different character issue, an entirely different character. And I think we'll all be watching. I mean, we're all citizens, and so we're interested in this as citizens. But as observers, we'll be watching to see whether this is a strategy that pays off. My feeling is it will not pay off, and as the penalties in this strategy become apparent, I think that the polarization problem that we're looking at right now will become smaller, simply because both parties, it seems to me, in our system, it's incumbent on both parties to demonstrate open-mindedness, fairness, moderation, and approach, and so forth. Polarization is just mildly different on the Democratic side. Their party line votes are almost as impressive. As I say, unanimous votes are unheard of, really unheard of. Even the Clinton impeachment in 1998 drew 5 or 6 Democrat votes in the House. It's I think this is something that all of us, one way or another, are watching with great interest.
Thanks, David. Our next question. With the economy, Iran, Korea, and now the swine flu, has any real work been done yet in terms of healthcare reform? And I think you've spoken to this a little bit, David, but maybe you can reiterate and extrapolate.
Sure. I think that, as I said earlier, I think in the stimulus package, we saw some significant investments in areas where there could be profound changes in the healthcare system. But certainly, the real big item of reforming healthcare lies ahead. Many of the fights that the Democrats chose to take on as part of the stimulus package were very winnable. Healthcare reform is going to be much tougher coming into this year. And, I think many have asked the question whether there's room within the agenda with some of the other challenges that have been outlined. But I think as an observer of these debates on healthcare reform, I do think that if the Congress and the President don't take this issue on this year, that it may get pushed aside for quite a while, because I think it is such a challenging issue to take on, and the unique circumstances of the first year in office with a new president, and I think these unique economic times really indicate that I think if there's going to be a shot for healthcare reform, it really does need to be this year.
Thanks, Dave. The next question, I think, is an interesting one. Does the president have a broad vision, a truly broad vision, or is he spending his first 100 days simply trying to plug holes in the dike? And I wanted to maybe send this to Brooks Jackson, trying to get you to speak to the extent to which maybe how Obama negotiates that fork in the road, how that might be related to the kind of rhetoric he employs to justify the decisions he's making, one way or the other, in terms of the big picture or the more sort of utilitarian everyday decisions he has to make. So is he visionary? Is he plugging holes? Does his rhetoric indicate one direction or the other?
Oh, gee, well, this is a little bit out of my line because we're used to dealing with specific factual claims here. Broad vision or not, I guess that calls for personal judgment, just as a voter and somebody, as a journalist who's covered him, I'd say so, and I think as we've seen that expressed through the campaign, through many speeches, through the first 100 days. Others may disagree. It's just going to depend on how it strikes the individual.
Nice. Do you have any sense, Brooks, that it would be more or less likely for a president to get caught up in less than truthful discussions if he was trying to speak about more specific, tangible items versus talking about big picture kinds of issues? Or do you think it doesn't quite matter? It works in the same way either
If you
scenario?
confine yourself to glittering generalities and never have any specifics, then it's hard for anybody to criticize you for being factually inaccurate, because essentially you're engaging in fact-free rhetoric. The president, much of what he says is of that kind. He's painting with broad strokes. Quite often he gets into individual statistics and specific factual claims. As I said at the outset, mostly those hold up, but occasionally they don't, but not to a degree that I've found unusual for presidents in Washington.
Could I get into this bit? If we were talking about Woodrow Wilson, I could give you 5 or 6 things he said he would do as president and did, including anti-child labor, 8-hour day, and many, many other things, fair collection of senators. If we're talking about Franklin Roosevelt, I couldn't, but I can tell you that he wanted the world to know that he was there. He was dismissed at his time by Walter Lippmann as a lightweight and genial man who would like to be president. But if you look at the record as governor, he was already talking about unemployment compensation and old age programs, and Niagara Falls were a way of cheap power for upstate New York. And he's saying that he's had, frankly, if we had FactCheck, he would have run Roosevelt out of the water with his Lend-Lease plans and his, what Claire Booth said, lying his way into war, backed off, or going as far into the edge as he possibly could for national security. As King George said, he led public opinion by following it, or by at least appearing to follow it. And I think Obama is that kind of president. I think Darren Spears-Goodwin's got this right. I think he's got the outline. He wants people to know he was here. He doesn't want to be president just to mark time and make who's who, would be the first of this or that. He wants the world to know that he was here. I think his instincts, if Reagan's instincts were instinctively conservative, his are instinctively progressive when it comes to doing what David said, of having a more active role of government in the economy or having a health care plan. Whether he has the 9 parts in his head right now, I don't think so. But I think his general parameters, the big brush type of a president, not a Jimmy Carter, so fixed on the details he can't see the forest. Maybe David disagrees with me there.
I think that vision can become submerged under the pressure of operational necessity and so forth. I think that even happened with Reagan, somebody who's always called a visionary, and a vision of a kind of uniqueness of America. And that becomes submerged in '81 when he's pressing tax reduction, which, by the way, people criticize this president, or they raise questions about whether this president's setting priorities. I think it's at least fair to reflect back on, in fact, James Baker, in a interview with Wall Street Journal, which was actually complimentary, he was complimentary about the Barack foreign policy in a very interesting way, said that unlike Reagan, Obama has not concentrated on the economy quite the way. In other words, he questions whether he's advancing too many ideas. It's, I think, fair to remember that Reagan, in passing a tax reduction act, that is a single bill in July of '81, in effect enacted the entire program that we would call the Reagan Revolution today. What that did was it altered the direction and the expectations surrounding the federal government. If the Obama administration finds in the course of managing this recession, this restructuring recession that we have, it will bring forth measures, tax measures, as well as regulatory measures that will match it. My guess is that the entire panoply of programs that we're talking about, healthcare, green industries, education, sustainability issues of all kinds will be bound up in a relatively few number of bills. I don't see a lack of priority setting in this administration. They see the economy is going to change, and with it, assumptions about how many sectors of our life work. I think that is the evolving issue. Republicans recognize it, and that certainly accounts for a good deal of polarization, as Diana and others are speaking about. And I think that the fact that he has established priorities accounts for the fact that we see a good deal of resistance already. If he were not setting priorities, I think people would find reasons, in fact, to accept him selectively.
Now we're running out of time, so maybe I'll offer up one more question. Anyone can take it, and they'll have to just be brief. It's from the Gazette in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and they want to know, has the economic crisis allowed Obama to push his agenda farther in the first 100 days than he would have in good times, or is that just a myth?
I would say, I'll be very brief, I'll say not yet. Emmanuel said we have to use the crisis to move forward, but very little has passed in that sense. We have the stimulus passed, and maybe in the next 100 days, I would say by September we'll know. By the end of the first session of this Congress, I think his style will have emerged, and we will see.
Well, let me thank you all again for taking part, for your insights. Diana Mutz, David Eisenhower, David Grande, Brooks Jackson, and Al Felsenberg. And thank you from the Annenberg School for Communication. I hope you all enjoyed the panel and got a lot out of the conversation, the discussion, the interesting kinds of positions folks tried to offer up about Obama's first 100 days. We'll see how he goes moving forward. Thanks.